Hello, hello, everybody. I'm Sue Hitzman. Hey, I got a question for you today. Have you ever met somebody who's fully committed to their running routine? Somebody who runs essentially every day, almost obsessively? Most of these people, if you talk to them, they're suffering with pain and injury, except one guy who seems to defy the common mishaps of running, Dr. Jason Karp. Now, full disclosure, Jason is one of the most knowledgeable educators in exercise physiology and has authored literally over 15 books on running, which look at every type of training option, which he himself will say is what people need to figure out to have a successful running career. Now, while everybody's born to run, I wonder, is that true? So, in this conversation, we talk about his stellar career as a professor, a running coach, tips and tricks to keep you running for a lifetime, and a whole lot more. And remember, if you love this conversation, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the podcast, and of course, support the podcast by sharing it with your friends. Tell them about what we're doing here. So, if you're ready to learn what's missing in your running routine, I hope this conversation gives you some knowledge on what you want to add or maybe take away from your running life. Here is Dr. Jason Karp. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming on Anatomical Gangster. I have so many fantastic questions, I think, in my brain that I want to ask you. But for those people who don't know your work and all of the incredible books that you've written, to which there are many, I think, am I right that it's 15 books that you've written in your career?
Yeah, that has, yeah.
15 books, amazing. So will you share just a little bit about your background and all of the, I guess what you've done for the running community, for the world, really?
Uh, well, yeah, it started when I was a kid. I just fell in love with the science of athletic performance, and it placed me on a road that I'm still following all these years later. And so I've never known anything else. Running has been my whole life. It's taken many forms, but everything I've done has been in one way or another, all been about running. So
Yeah,
yeah, I've had the opportunity to do lots of different things, and yeah, just created a life about running and writing and coaching and speaking and teaching. I just got done teaching college this past school year.
incredible, right? I
So
mean, you have a PhD, and you went
yeah,
back after all these years and decided that you were going to teach collegiately. Now, was it undergraduate or graduate students you were teaching?
it was, it was both.
Both. And what was the topic?
Yeah.
What were you speaking on with these guys?
I taught 5 classes each semester in the exercise science department. So I was teaching exercise physiology for both the undergrads and the grad students. There was one class on human performance nutrition for the graduate students. One class was on lab techniques for the graduate students. And then there was a couple of classes on introduction to exercise science for the undergrads, and fitness evaluation, exercise prescription for the undergrads. So I had a nice array of classes for both graduate students and undergraduate. And yeah, it was great because I spent a lot of time outside of academia. When I got done with the PhD, I moved to San Diego and did my own thing. And so after all these years, I thought, yeah, why not? I love teaching, and I saw an opportunity. And so yeah, so I moved to Georgia to do that, and yeah, it was great.
I love that. Well, I always think, when we're practitioners and educators, it's kind of like that's just what you do. You teach people. And to go back into the collegiate world where you have to actually organize a study plan, a curriculum, right? It almost sharpens your own acuity for
Oh,
what you want
very,
to teach, right? So
very
can
much
I say
so.
you've
Yeah.
become smarter, which I think it might be impossible, but you might be smarter now than you were before.
Oh, I don't know about that, but yeah, certainly when you're standing in front of students, and yeah, you have to plan each class. That was the most challenging part, was that because I had 5 classes each semester, it ended up coming out to 9 classes per week. And so that's a lot to teach. It's a lot to prepare for. You can't just walk in there and wing it every day. And so yeah, that was the most challenging part for me. That I had to create the syllabus for every class and create all the exams and know exactly what I was going to cover every day. And so yeah, that took up a lot of time. But I love the environment. I mean, there's something unique about the college environment, and to try to not only educate but inspire these kids too. I call them kids, but yeah, to
Our
try to
kids
inspire them to do something. Yeah, but I know, I know it makes me feel old now to see them as kids, but like I was old enough to be their parent, and
did.
so but because I spent so much time at school myself, I feel like I could really relate to what they're going through, and I made that known to them, in the beginning of the semester, that I wanted them to know that even though I was the professor, I spent 15 and a half years in college myself when I added it all up, and so I really understood what they were going through, and so I think I'm able to see things from their perspective better than a lot of other professors can. And plus, I spent so much time out of academia that I could give them all this real world experience and tell them what it's like when they really get out of school and what they really need to know and what they don't need to know. And
Did.
I used to tell them I don't believe in exams. I had to make exams, but I try to minimize that aspect of it because in the real world, you don't have to study for exams, and everyone's got a phone in their hand. You can look up anything you want, and so I
Exactly,
tried to
right? You
minimize
can you
that
can look
part.
it
Yeah,
all up. You don't necessarily need to study. You don't
right.
even need to write a dissertation. You could just go ahead and have
You're right.
ChatGPT for you do it now, right? Yeah, so I think
Right,
thinking
right.
thinking critically might be a novel idea for students to consider. And because you're teaching in this collegiate world, do you think that with exercise physiology and all of the modern technology that we have, do you think that there's new information or something that you've discovered from what you learned in school or the syllabus that you learned from that you think, hey, when I was in school, we were looking at the body this way, but today we kind of have more information. Was there any of that, or do you feel like you stayed with some root foundation from your own studies from years ago?
Oh, well, a lot of it is the root foundation, but I mean, we know a lot more now than we did when I was back in school, and because just research has advanced, and we have the ability to measure things on a molecular level now. And when I was an undergraduate, we didn't have all that, and so I think that especially for graduate students, I think that school does get harder with each generation because we know things on a smaller and smaller level. There's more to know now than there was 50 years ago. So yeah, I think in the students' defense, I think that it does get more challenging for them, even though they have the technology to look things up. But we know things on a much smaller scale now than we used to, which makes things harder. I remember just when I was in school and what I had to learn compared to the generation before me, I was thinking about that even back then, and now it's even more so now. And so I try to bring in the research, especially with the graduate students. We spent a lot of time talking about the research rather than just textbook information, which is more the undergraduate superficial level. But for the graduate students, for like my undergraduate exercise physiology class, it was kind of all seminar kind of work that we would discuss the papers. Like each week we had a section of papers based on the topic that we were discussing that week, and then we would spend time discussing all the research in that area so that they became familiar with who are the big players in this field. If you want to know about lactate, you go talk to George Brooks at UC Berkeley. If you want to know about the central governor, you go talk to Timothy Noakes in South Africa and look at their research. So I mean, I even went as far back as A.V. Hill in the 1920s, looking at the research that he did. There's a lot of what we know about oxygen consumption in the 20s. And so I brought in all these researchers and all of their papers, and we spent a lot of time discussing it so that they could get an understanding on a higher level than just what you read in a textbook.
Yeah, that's so important too, because there's so much new science and new research studies going out, and also using different tools and devices to do these research papers. So I think if, especially for a graduate student, if you're going to critically think and actually be hired to do something after school,
Yeah.
understanding how even research papers are formulated and understanding all of the things that they exclude to be able to really refine a very small confine of research, which I think, from being somebody who, thought I was going to go down that road for just being in a lab and researching, and then realizing that some of the research that you're doing is like you're actually doing research to yield a conclusion for the benefit of something else. And sometimes that's a little blurry where it becomes, I think, a little bias. And so there's a lot of, I don't know, precariousness with research. And I think helping, young students really critically think about the research papers and to also remember to look at the bibliographies and who they're citing, and then maybe go down that rabbit hole a little bit to learn a little bit more, because otherwise you sort of go, oh, like that's a scientific fact, but that may or may not be true, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly what we spend time doing because, yeah, it's not enough to just read the end of the papers and the conclusion that they come to. You have to look at, well, how did they do the study? What were the statistics? And how did they design the study? And that's one thing that the graduate students also, were introduced to. They all take a research methods and design class, just like I did when I was back their age. And because it's important to understand how the research is done so that you can actually look at it with a critical eye instead of just go right to the conclusion and thinking that that's the facts.
That's right. That's right. Well, and you've written, again, like you've written 15 books all on running, to which I always think to myself, how much do you need to know beyond, like, what is
Right.
running, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like, but this is the really incredible thing. Like, I remember saying to a friend of mine who was a marathon runner, ran all the time, consistent runner, and I said to him, I hate running. And he was like, you hate running? You just seem like a body that could run. I said, it just always bothers my knees. I feel like cement running just doesn't seem like a good idea. And so he said to me, let me see you run. And he says, you're not really running with a good stride. There's a different way to run. And I just thought to myself, I'd never really thought about that back then. What do you mean there's a different way to run? So all of these books, tell me kind of the uniquenesses about the books. Like, what's different between one book and the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I've always tried with my books to write something that hasn't already been written because there are a lot of books on the topic and they all pretty much say the same thing. Same with weight loss. And two of my books are on weight loss, but one is on running for weight loss because no one had published a book specifically on running for weight loss. And the other book on weight loss is about the habits of successful weight losers from the National Weight Control Registry, because nobody wrote a book on all the studies that have come out of the National Weight Control Registry and look at, well, what do people who lose weight and keep it off? What are their habits? What exactly are they doing? How many calories do they burn every day? How many calories do they consume every day? What is their composition of their diet? What methods do they have in place to make sure that they don't gain the weight back? So for all the books, and the running book's the same thing, that I try to look at what are the holes in the marketplace, what hasn't been written, and then combine that with what I feel my expertise is, and that's how I come up with the idea for these books.
And so, like, so I know that I mean, to me, there's different things to think about, hypertrophy, interval. What are some of the ways, like, name a few different ways of, I don't know if I want to call them running drills or running trainings, because I know, you've been to Africa and with the Kenyans, right? You've worked in Kenya, work with the Kenyan runners. You've been around the world and really looking at the uniqueness of each type of runner. Like, there's different ways to train, different
Yeah.
types of training protocols. What do you tell me a little bit about the differences of those training protocols that you found?
Yeah. Yeah, and then some of my books are exactly on that, like the Kenya experience. And I wrote a book about my experience going to Kenya and putting together a group of athletes and coaching them for a while. And because they do think very differently there, they have no, they're so naive to the science. They don't read any research. They have no idea what VO2 max is. I mean, they just have no idea of any of it, but yet they're so good and they all train the same way. They do more of a holistic style of training where it's all based on feel. They run a lot. They run twice a day, every day, and a couple times a week. They're doing a hard workout, but it's not scientifically designed. It's more of inductive reasoning, whereas in the US and other Western societies, it's more of the deductive reasoning. We take more of a scientific approach. If you want to improve VO2 max, you do it this way, but they don't know from that. And so there it's all about just trial and error over many years. And so they all train the same. There's one town in Kenya that is the epicenter of Kenyan distance running. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of really, really good runners in this one town. You walk outside your door and there they are. They're running all over the place. You can't help but see them because it's a very small rural town and they're always running. But they all do the same thing. There's no periodization of their training over there. They just join a group and they do whatever the group is doing. But they have learned over, some decades now of what the best pattern is for them. And, does it work equally as effective for everybody? Probably not, but that's how they do it. And they've been very successful with that. So they
So
take more of an inductive approach over there.
So when you were there in Kenya, I mean, I always think of the Kenyan runners as being some of the most elite runners. And
Oh,
I've seen, right, and I've seen some of the research of like, why is it that at the end of a marathon, a Kenyan runner could be a quarter mile back and all of a sudden it's like they just can suddenly explode and just crush the other runners, and you watch the other ones just looking like they're dying. And one of the research studies had shown that Kenyan runners, their Achilles tendon is much longer, and so they have a lot more elastic recoil, and so they store energy much faster and longer than and their American counterparts. And there's also another study that shows that elite runners, when they look at their microbiomes, they have a particular microbiome. I think that they said it was Vianella is what they called it, and they said that they find in really high level elite runners who rarely get injured, who seem to sleep well, they are always training and they feel good, that they have this particular microbiome that eats lactic acid and quickly converts it back into energy. And not everybody has that. And so now they're trying to, create a product, a pill that has Vianella in it so that other athletes can take it and help to eat away this lactic acid. And I think it sounds really
everyone's looking for a shortcut.
right. That's exactly right. So, and I would wonder, there's no real shortcut in it, but I know that you've been running for your whole life, and you are somebody who says you don't really stretch, you don't adopt any major eating routine, you eat cereal and like regular food and all these other things. And I think, and you've never sustained really any terrible injuries, right? So what of all of these Theraguns and all these other things? Are they really making better runners, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very skeptical of it. And yeah, and you look at the runner, especially in the US in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, they didn't have any of that stuff then, and nobody's running faster now than they did then, and nobody's recovering faster now than they did then. And our bodies have been exquisitely designed to do what it needs to do to survive, and so we evolved to run, and all these mechanisms that we try to throw at our bodies, all these gadgets, they don't have any significant impact on what your body is already able to do on its own. And so, yeah, maybe I'm a purist when it comes to running, but running is the purest form of activity. It is the one activity that every human, every animal knows how to do it without ever being taught how to do it. Something like swimming that's not natural for human beings. We have to learn how to swim. But running is something that we all inherently know how to do. Nobody
Yeah,
taught
nobody
us when we,
taught us, right? Nobody taught us. You just watch a kid suddenly walk and then all of a sudden they're running.
yeah, we go from a crawl to a walk to a run
Yeah,
naturally without anybody
naturally.
ever showing us how to do it or telling us how to do it.
Yeah.
Running is the most natural activity. Walking would be the most natural, and running is the next most natural thing. And so, yeah, it's all these gadgets that are trying to improve performance and improve recovery. The research doesn't support that they have a significant impact,
Yeah.
and the empirical evidence doesn't support that. If anything, it's a placebo effect that you're told that it's supposed to make you recover faster, and so you feel like you recover faster because that's what the marketing tells you you're supposed to feel. And so, if anything, it's in your head. It's not in your legs. It's Even the
Yeah, whether or
research.
not, right, whether or not my body's actually going to recover faster. Like I love, I mean, I love tools. I love air compression legs and things like this, because I just like the way it feels at the end of the night to just kind of have that pressure. And I think that sensory awareness of compression, or like the Theragun ideas and things like that. I don't like the percussions, but certain things I really like the way that it feels. And I find that on those days that I use those, I tend to have a more restful night's sleep, which I think in some ways boosts my recovery. But I don't know if the measurement of improvement, I think that's the big thing, is how many people are actually measuring, creating
Right.
notable measurements, except for distance and time. I think that those are the ones that I see, and I'm not a fan of running on cement. So now that I've moved down to Florida, now I'm in New York right now. So what did I do yesterday? I went out on a 6 mile run, and I feel great today, and it just to run on the bridle path and to be out in nature. There's a whole endorphin, and I'm not listening to music. I'm just letting my mind just not think so much, which I think is also part of the healing potential. Rather than it being a competitive thing, I'm doing something to complete something in a time, which I think is one
Right.
of the things that can trip us out a little bit, right? The psychology of
Sure.
that. If I've got to
Mm.
run faster, I might actually really start to push myself, and then I tear my Achilles tendon, and I'm like, what the heck did I do to myself, right? So
Right.
there's this
Right.
yeah, there's a little catch all in the
Yeah.
running potential. What do you think is the thing when I see a lot of runners in my clinical practice. I see a lot of them who get injured. What do you think is the thing that causes injury? Is it repetitive stress? Is it technique?
Let's
What is it?
see. Yeah, well, there's a lot of research on this, as you can imagine, because even though running is a natural activity, a lot of runners still get injured. And the rates of injuries have not decreased over the years, despite all these things we're throwing at people to do. And so, beyond all else, the major thing that causes injuries, I mean, it's very multifactorial. There's lots of things, and the research has not been able to pull out one thing and say this is the one thing above all else that is causing injuries, because in each individual case, it could be many factors. It could be a combination of the training errors and biomechanics. There's a lot of different things. But having said that, the thing that causes injury the most is simply adding too much stress at too rapid of a rate for that vulnerable body part to adapt to. And so with running, there's a lot of micro trauma. And just on a 5 mile run, you're taking approximately 5,000 steps. So it's that repeated micro trauma over and over and over again. And if there's some vulnerable body part that can't handle that, and so if you increase the volume and or the intensity at too rapid of a rate, then that vulnerable body part will become injured. And so beyond all else, right? Because if you don't run at all, you're not going to get injured, right? So it's the stress of running, but it's that repeated stress over and over and over again. That's what causes the injuries.
Yeah, that
And
makes a
so you
lot of
have to be very
sense.
meticulous.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be
And
very meticulous about how you add that stress and not add too much stress at too rapid of a rate.
that's right. And I think that's a really big message, because I think that, especially for people who decide, I'm going to start running for weight loss, and they haven't run in, 20 years, and they're all of a sudden they go out there and they think that they're going to run 3 miles and not pay the price. And I always try to encourage my clients, why don't you, instead of going, you can either do it one of two ways. You could go time or you can go distance. So if you want to go distance, why don't you try to run a mile? And then the next time you go, run a 1.25 mile, and then 1.5 mile, 1.75, and two. Go in small increments, because in less than a couple of weeks, you'll be running 3 miles and acclimating to the pattern. Or go run for 5 minutes and see if you can do 5 minutes without stopping, then go to 5.5 or 6 minutes, and so on, right? So I think people like really, take that one haphazard leap rather than the
Yeah.
small steps in the right direction. That's a really good advice on that one. Because again, you've trained so many people, you have so much experience in running. Do you think that there's an easier trainability, or there's more hazards in male or female runners? Do you see more issues in one, male or female in running?
The only time in which females are more at risk of injury than males is when a female starts to have menstrual cycle dysfunction.
Right.
Otherwise, there's no greater incidence of injuries in women compared to men.
Yeah.
But when women start to have issues with their menstrual cycle, then that affects their bone health, because estrogen has the biggest impact on bone health than any other factor. Most people think it's calcium and vitamin D, and while that's important, it's not as important as estrogen.
That's right.
And so any condition that lowers estrogen puts the bones at risk for injury.
Mhm.
So when women start to have menstrual cycle dysfunction, and if they lose it altogether and become amenorrheic, then there is a very big association between amenorrhea and bone fractures. And so that's when women have to be really careful. That doesn't mean that they can't run if they're amenorrheic. There's plenty of college runners who are amenorrheic, but they're quite good runners. It's just that you have to then attend to that and make sure that you're not putting the bones at risk for injury.
Right.
So if you are amenorrheic, then you have to do everything else possible to make sure that your bones are strong enough that the running won't cause a stress fracture. So
And do you
then you
think,
have to make sure
do you
calcium
think,
and vitamin D strength
yeah,
training.
do you think that's why, a lot of women, I have a lot of female runners who have been running for years, but then when they get into perimenopause and then menopause, all of a
Yeah.
sudden they're feeling more of the joint issues in their bodies. And I hope everybody's hearing this is, one of the interesting things. I've actually said it on a couple of other podcasts. There have been a number of researchers, when the question is asked, when you do research on rats, especially like with connective tissue or blood or whatever, that they don't like using female rats because estrogen gets in the way. And I'm like, well, this is why female health is so far behind men's health, and understanding estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and the hormones, and how they can influence your gut health, your microbiomes, your connective tissue, your ligaments, right? Everything is going to pay a price. And so, I think that there's something to be said about, training where now you're practically anemic, and, your body is not restoring anything. And then maybe you're getting all of these other symptoms. And I think that there's something here where we could probably prevent that by just catching the pre-pain or pre-problem signals and messages that
Yeah.
the body has, right?
Yeah, that's why two of my books are actually on this topic, because I've always had a fascination with training female runners,
Mm.
because it is much more complex than training male runners, and understanding the menstrual cycle and understanding anemia, which is also very common among
Yep.
female runners. So yeah, so I've written two books on this because I find it a fascinating topic, and how to organize your training around the menstrual cycle, understanding when it's better to push the endurance, when it's better to back off from that
Right.
based on estrogen and the fluctuation of estrogen and progesterone.
Right.
I find that all very fascinating, even though it may sound weird coming from a guy, but there are plenty of men who are, you know, who study women, and I happen to be one of them. I love the topic. I love female physiology and what that means for training and how women can optimize their training.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're saying that. I mean, I know that we're all human. There's only one race, it's the human race, right? But female bodies are different. And especially like if you are having a cycle and you're not in menopause, as I am and many other women are, you don't want to be really training hard in the premenstrual, right before and during, because that's where your ligaments are more lax. You have a higher tendency, if you have hypermobility, to actually have joints get a little loose during those times. Those are, or I always say, the times where go to the gym and be on those nice shiny machines and go nice and slow and strength work, or do something else, but don't get into heavy stretching and don't get into long endurance runs, because you have a higher risk of injury during those times of your. So I think that
Mhm.
women tend to have more of the periodization, the cycling trainings. I think that they tend to thrive more on that. I'm sure you probably see things like that too.
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, one of the chapters of one of my books on running is running periodization, and I have a whole chapter on menstrual cycle periodization. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So if people are hearing this and they're like, well, now I'm not really sure what to do, how does someone decide what type of training might work better for them? Do you have like, hey, if you tend to be someone who X, Y, or Z, oftentimes, I would tell you to start here with a type of running style. Is there, periodization works better for particular people, doesn't work for others? Or how do you select what kind of running style to pick?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some of it is to get involved in a lot of activities and know where your strengths are. You always want to train to your strengths. And so a lot of how a person should train, at least with running, comes down to muscle fiber type.
Mhm.
Are you more slow twitch fiber, which is really good for endurance? Are you more skewed toward fast twitch fibers, which is better for power and sprinting? Even though something like the marathon has become extremely popular in our society, I would venture to guess that a lot of people running marathons are probably not really suited for that because they don't have as much slow twitch fibers that lends themselves to something like a marathon, that
Yeah.
maybe they should be doing shorter races. But everybody thinks, well, if you're going to be a runner, you got to do the marathon. Everybody always asks me, how many marathons have you? When they find out I'm a runner, how many marathons have you? That's the first question they ask me. But I know that
How many marathons have you run?
see, there you go. I've only done 2, separated by 12 years, because I'm not a long distance runner. I've
Right.
always been better at the shorter, faster races.
Hmm.
I've always loved racing on the track, and even now at my little bit older age, I still am better at speed than I am at endurance. So I've always settled on the middle distance races. Like tomorrow, I'm actually running the track meet tomorrow. I'm going to race 800 meters. So like the half mile to mile are my best events probably in the whole sport.
Yeah.
And so I usually stick to 5K races and shorter because that suits me. It suits my physiology, and so my training is geared like that as well, because you always want to train to your strengths. So
That's
the first question would be for people to ask themselves, well, what are my strengths as an animal? Am I better suited for aerobic long endurance kinds of activities? Or am I better suited for the shorter, faster, more power strength types of activities? And knowing that about yourself goes a long way to how then you train. How do you skew your training? Do you do more short, fast interval type training, or you do a lot of long runs, a lot of long tempo runs? That helps a lot. So you got to know yourself first and where your strengths lie, and then you can come up with the right training plan for you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that takes a real long time too, because when I was
Does, yeah.
younger and I was into cycling, I started out in short rides. Maybe it would be 10-mile rides, 20-mile rides, simple. And um, when I met a coach, and he said, I'd love to help train you a little bit. I actually think you'd be better at distance. And I was like, how can you tell? Like, what do you mean? And he's just like, well, just your body composition, I think that you would go better in the long distance. And so he trained me, and he also said that there was more money to be had in races that were distance back when I was in my 20s, and females were really trying to come up into the rankings. The Cat 4 riders, they would finally have these rides, and you'd apply and get into a race and win $1,000, and that was awesome. But it took me 3 years over time to go from 20-mile rides to 30 to 40 to 50 to 80 and 100-mile rides. And while I was good at it, I think that my body started to pay the price for that, my neck, my hips. And I started realizing that 50 miles was really my pocket, that in the longer rides, I had a lot longer recovery. I really didn't feel right for days and days and days. Whereas when I rode 50, I could get up in the morning, take some stretching, move a little bit, and I was like off to the races. And I could have done another 50 the next day. So I think you're right. Finding out what really works for you is the kind of the experiment. And I guess we're just like a
Yeah,
big
yeah,
incubation tank, right, for trying to
yeah.
figure out what works for us. I love that.
Yeah, and it does take time. I mean, I was lucky that I started running when I was a kid. So people who are adults who started in the sport when they were kids and they ran track and cross country, they had those years to figure all that out where they're going to be best at. But someone who takes up running when they're 40, yeah, it's going to take some time to figure out, where you're best at. A lot of people just go straight to the marathon because that's, that's what society
That's
does. Everyone's
it's
enamored with
crazy.
the marathon.
It's 26
Yeah, I'm
point.
right. But that,
Yeah, it's just so many miles. I mean, I just don't even understand. And because you're just breaking down, so you're catabolizing yourself, you're eating yourself alive going that far. So thinking of that, what do you think about nutrition for running? Do you think that nutrition plays a significant role in running and in the success of having a good running career?
It does, of course, but out of the three things that determine how fast you're going to run, genetics, training, and nutrition falls to the bottom. I mean, genetics is obviously the biggest. I mean, most of what
Sure.
we are is genetics. You can't overcome that. No amount of training is going to turn a basset hound into a greyhound. You have to be born a greyhound if you want to be among the best in the world, or even the best in your neighborhood. And so genetics is most important. And then obviously the training, then you got to do the training. Then, that's the second most important. So nutrition is important, but it's not as important as the other two. Genetics, obviously, you can't control. So that just leaves the two things you can control, the training and nutrition. And so the nutrition is important, but not as important as the training that you do.
Gotcha.
Having said that, the biggest thing nutritionally for runners is the amount of carbohydrate in your diet. If you're going to do something like train for marathons, you're going to be running a lot of miles per week. You have to eat a lot of carbohydrate. Going back to when we were talking about the Kenyan runners, their diet is nearly 100% carbohydrate. They have very little money for food. They don't eat a lot. They don't have money for things like meat where they can get protein. And when I was there, I couldn't believe, how little they eat and that their diet is nearly 100% carbohydrate. Now, it's healthy carbohydrate. They don't have freezers and refrigerators. So what they're eating is very fresh. They live off the land. There's a lot of farms there. It's very rural. They're not storing things in a freezer or refrigerator. So they don't eat packaged food. They're not eating sugar.
Hmm.
So it's very healthy grains, rice, but it is nearly 100% carbohydrate diet that they have. They get some protein from milk straight from the cow. They don't have pasteurization over there, so they're drinking milk straight from the cow, which obviously we can't do over here. And so yeah, so the biggest nutritional aspect for distance running is the carbohydrate content of the diet and
And
making sure that it's enough to sustain.
what about the psychology of running or kind of community of running? Do you think that having collaboration with other runners, as much as running seems to be a very kind of isolated world, right? We don't. I mean, we have teams, running teams, but in general, running is an individual sport. But how do you feel community and finding other people to run with, and just the psychology of running? How do you think that plays a role in people's performance?
I think it plays a pretty large role. I mean, again, that's something different in Kenya. I mean, they all train groups and they believe that that is the only way to be successful. In the US, we do have a lot of groups, but running does become more of an individualized thing in the US because, you have to drive to where the group is meeting. I mean, in San Diego here, we have lots of running clubs and a lot of people join them. Me personally, I just end up running by myself because it's quicker and fast. I just walk out my door and I go run. And I live across the street from a track. I do my interval workouts on the track, and so, yeah, I think it is important, especially to train with people who are slightly better than you. And I think it's very important, but it's not necessary. I think there are plenty of examples of great runners who train by themselves, but certainly for people who want to have the emotional support, the psychological support, yeah, then certainly. training in groups is much better than training by yourself all the time. It's easy to push yourself if you train with other people.
I love that. Yeah, and I mean, I think that message of running with people who are a little bit better than you, right? I mean, I would have never thought to run a half marathon, but my friend Jeff, who would run with me in the park, and it would kind of be like a therapy session. We would talk and run, and then we would be quiet, and then maybe he would pick up the pace a little bit and see if I could still talk to him. And he's like, it's kind of a good litmus test that you can breathe through your nose. If I ask you not to breathe through your mouth, that you are actually getting enough oxygen to cycle it through. But it also kind of gets your strength up in your ability to run. And I really, by the end of the summer, we would be running up to the George Washington Bridge, stopping, having a drink, just talking a little bit, and then running all the way back. And I just felt so successful that I thought, gosh, I would have never in my life thought I would run so far. And when I did triathlons, my first triathlon, I remember practically crying. I think I was crying when we got to the running part. I'm like, we should all just put rollerblades on. Like, this is terrible. This is so long. Like, I just ran and I swam, and now you want me to run. This is like so stupid. I can't take it. My body's killing me. But then after I did a few, I think there's a real emotional endurance that comes up where you're not thinking about running. You're not thinking about the thing ahead. You're just really living presently in the moment of it. Have you done triathlons? Have you ever done many of those?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now living in San Diego, well, I've been living here a long time, and I was living here a long time, and I hadn't done any. And San Diego is the birthplace of the sport. This is where triathlon began. And so I had been living here for a while, and I thought, well, how could I not do a triathlon when I'm living in the birthplace of
Right.
triathlon? So a couple years ago, started doing them, and they're addictive. I mean, I stick with the sprint triathlon because, again, that suits me and my physiology.
Yeah.
I would want to do something like an Ironman triathlon. That just, I
No.
mean, you're literally out there all day long. I mean, you got to have a lot of slow twitch fibers to get through an Ironman triathlon. It's
Yeah.
long, and so that doesn't really suit me. But I've done some sprint triathlons where the whole thing takes about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, depending on the exact length of each segment. And I find it addicting. I love it now. I mean,
Love that.
it's you try to figure out where you can get, because with running, even though running will always be my first love, it's just the running. And so there's only one way to get faster. You got to get faster on the run. Well,
Right.
with the triathlon, you figure out, well, how do I cut off a minute or two on the swim? And what can I do on the bike? And the transition, what can I do in the transition to make those faster? And there's many places that you can tweak to try to figure out how to make the whole thing faster. And so, yeah, I find it addicting to put all three together to try to come up with, your best performance for the whole triathlon. I really like the challenge of it.
I think that's
So I'll
beautiful.
keep doing them.
So I ask all of everybody that I've ever interviewed, I always ask the same question. I always love hearing what the answer is. So the question is, if you could tell people something that you know that most people don't know anything about, but if they did, it may very well change the course of their life, or how they age, their longevity, their overall sense of life, what is it?
Oh boy, that's a really good question. You put me on the spot, and this may sound like a predictable answer coming from me because I am biased toward running, but I've always believed that, and I'll believe for the rest of my life, that if everybody went outside and walked or ran a few miles a day, we would have a much healthier society. We would get rid of obesity, and we would drastically reduce heart disease, because running is perhaps the most potent physical activity, the most potent exercise that people can do, both for their body and for their mind. I mean, there's a lot of research on both the physical and emotional and psychological health benefits of running. And I think the reason why running stands above everything else is because it is who we are as animals. Everything else, all the other different types of exercise that humans do, is not as natural of an activity as running is. Running is what we evolved to be.
That's
And
right.
I think that's why running stands above everything else and what it can do for us, both physically and psychologically.
Yeah, it's a really great answer. And I agree with you. Like I said, Nobody taught you how to create yourself. Creation is a process. We created ourselves. We create our own placenta. We create the process of our lives. And then we go from, being on our back to being on our belly to crawling to creeping to walking to then running. And it is remarkable. But I think you're right. Of all of the fad programs, the exercise programs, and all the other things, the most fundamental thing is just get up and get outside into nature, walk, run, breathe some fresh air, and
Yeah.
kind of commune with your own body to just move. I think it's great. Endorphins, I think it really stimulates the nervous system in a very positive way. I think it's stress in the body, but I think it's the good kind of stress that really challenges our own development of our cells and keeps us feeling youthful and active. I think that's a really great
Yeah.
message. I love that.
Yeah.
Well,
Good. Yeah.
Jason, I mean, always a pleasure to see you. I'm so grateful
Yeah, me
for,
too.
everything that you put out to the world. It's so great to have seen you go back and teach collegiately. I think that's also so noble. I mean, it's just, really sharing what you've learned over all these years and to bring it back to our youth. I think it's really critical because without that kind of perspective and real world natural perspective to bring it back, I think that, you're just studying from a box and passing tests and reading books, and that really doesn't give critical thinking much opportunity to shine. So thanks for going back out there and helping the world
Yeah.
learn a little bit more about that fundamental of running. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So those of you who are listening, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Jason Karp. And if you enjoy this, make sure you subscribe to our page. I'll be back next week with another conversation with another brilliant mind who is changing the way that we view our overall well-being. We'll see you soon. Thanks again for tuning in.